this Wednesday edition of Focal Point. We will have Executive Director John Collins from Harvest America on at the bottom of this hour to talk about a bus tour that's designed to promote awakening in America. So look forward to that. Now, to set up this kind of segment with you, I think it's important that we have some understanding of two things. Number one, what the purpose of taxation is. Now, as believers, guided by the scriptures, we believe that there is a place for taxes, that taxes in and of themselves are not evil, even though there are so many of them that are onerous and egregious, inappropriate, unethical, immoral, and just plain wrong. So we're not saying all taxes are good, but we are saying not all taxes are evil, that there is a place in God's economy and in the structure that God established in the scriptures for the collecting of taxes, and it is to provide for the expenses of government when it's exercising its legitimate functions. And I stress that. When taxes are collected in order for the government to do things that are illegitimate, then those are bad taxes. They are evil taxes. I just want to read the words from Romans chapter 13, where Paul talks about this very issue, the establishment of government. And he says in here that the government is God's servant for good. It is an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And for that reason, the servant of God, the state, does not bear the sword in vain. The sword is an instrument of capital punishment. As it's an instrument of punishment, lethal punishment, capital punishment. That's what you use to put somebody in prison, incarceration. So he's talking here about the role of government to enforce justice, and that's God's design for government. So when somebody infringes on our unalienable rights, whether it's the right to life, liberty, or property, then it is the government's responsibility, the state's responsibility, to take revenge on the wrongdoer, to punish those who have violated our unalienable rights. That is the proper role of government, and included in that is capital punishment. He does not bear the sword. You cut somebody's head off with a sword, he does not bear the sword for nothing. In fact, that's how Paul lost his life. He was executed as a criminal, had his head chopped off. Peter was crucified upside down because he wasn't a Roman citizen. So the sword was an instrument of lethal force. And Paul says that when the state is exercising its proper role of justice, and we would include in that national security, because that's part of protecting the security and the right to life of the American people. That's government's job, to secure those rights that have been given to us by God. Remember, the Declaration of Independence said that it's not the responsibility of government to grant rights. Only God can do that. It's the responsibility of government to secure those rights and to protect them, those unalienable rights that come from God, the first of which is the right to life, and the second is the right to liberty, and the third is the right to property. So if you have an enemy invader that comes in, wants to threaten our lives, wants to threaten our liberty, wants to threaten our property, then government has a proper role to repel the invader and to go out and find those who have taken away those rights from us and punish them wherever in the world they happen to be. That is the proper role of government. And so Paul says in verse 7, pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed. He says, look, the state, when it carries out these functions, is a minister of God. So your tax is essentially a tithe to support this minister of God. Just as you voluntarily make contributions to your church to support the minister of God that he's placed over your church family, so your taxes are like that. It's involuntary. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we voluntarily do this. It's involuntary, but those taxes are being collected in God's economy to pay the ministers of God who are responsible to administer justice. So when government is exercising its proper functions, it's appropriate for government to collect taxes for those functions. However, when government goes beyond its proper role, when it goes beyond its ordained role and still collects taxes, then those taxes are collected immorally and unjustly, unethically, and wrongly. And we have every right to protest. No constitutional basis for most of the taxes that are collected today. Most of the things our government does, it has no warrant in Scripture. It has no warrant in ethics. It has no warrant in the Constitution to do the things that it does. Now, the IRS is out there to collect these taxes. I've got a story here today from Virginia. They're still waiting for $125 million that they are owed by the IRS, and the IRS hasn't paid them in a year. They can't get their money from the IRS. So the IRS is not just going after individuals and conservative groups. It's now going after conservative states. Ken Cuccinelli, the Attorney General at Virginia, said this: for a long time, we thought it was glaring incompetence. This has to do with a lawsuit over Medicaid fraud, and Virginia took the lead on that, and they were awarded a payment by the IRS. Hasn't come through in a year. For a long time, we thought it was glaring incompetence, Cuccinelli said. But in light of the last month or two, we're now beginning to wonder whether maybe there are more deliberate motives. So in other words, Cuccinelli, and I think he's right in this, suggesting that the IRS under Obama, as a part of Obamagate, not just going after conservative groups, but going after states that are headed by conservative governors. And we're now finding out that the EPA is also involved in this kind of harassment of conservative groups. The Environmental Protection Agency is being accused, this is according to Eric Shaw, Fox News, of trying to charge conservative groups fees while largely exempting liberal groups. The fees applied to Freedom of Information Act requests. Allegedly, the EPA waived them for liberal groups far more than it did for conservative ones. Here's research from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And so, by the way, so if you got this kind of favoritism, which we clearly see with the IRS and all these applications for tax-exempt status, when you have favoritism, that is injustice. That is wrong. In fact, it is criminal behavior in many respects. Research by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a conservative Washington, D.C. think tank, claims that the political bias is routine, this is on the part of the EPA now, when it comes to deciding which groups are charged fees. This according to Christopher Horner, who is a solid citizen. He's a good researcher. Liberal groups have their fees for documents, that is requested under the Freedom of Information Act. There's a fee for that. Liberal groups have these fees waived 90% of the time, in contrast with conservative groups whose claims are denied fee waivers 90% of the time. So you have a conservative group that works on environmental issues, say they believe that global warming is an absolute total scam and a hoax and a sham, which it is, and they're working to educate the public. They request some documents from the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Environmental Protection Agency refuses to waive the fee for those documents 90% of the time. But a liberal group comes, and Horner mentioned some of them, an outfit called Earth Justice. They got waivers 17 out of 19 times. The Sierra Club got 7 out of 10, so they were the worst of the bunch. They only got 70% of their waiver fees granted, 11 out of 15. We found that 75 out of 82 groups were granted because there are groups that the EPA has decided are the favored groups. So 75 out of the 82 groups that went to the EPA got these fee waivers, and the worst of the bunch got waived 70% of the time. The conservative groups, the best of them, got waived 10% of the time. So you've got this favoritism. Remember, one of the principles, the foundational principles of the American system of justice is equality under the law. Absolute equality under the law. Nobody gets a break. Nobody gets cut slack because of who they are. Nope, we don't play favorites under the law. That compromises completely the whole concept of justice. Now, let's grab clip number 1. I talked about this yesterday. This is Representative Jim McDermott. He is a Democrat from the state of Washington. And remember, all this harassment of conservative groups, Tea Party groups, conservative groups, groups wanted to educate on the Constitution, pro-life groups, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, James Dobson's Family Talk, they just were requesting tax-exempt status, which should be routine. They met all the standards. It ought to be routine. They're primarily educational groups, a limited amount of political activity, which they're allowed to engage in. And they could not get status, and that affected their ability to raise funds People said, look, when I started the IVA back in Idaho, the Idaho Values Alliance in 2005, it took about 7 months to get our 501c3 status approved, and I had people that were waiting until we got that to help that ministry get rooted and grounded. They were waiting for that to come in, so there's absolutely no question. I can testify from personal experience. If you are denied that status by the IRS, it will affect your ability to raise funds. And a lot of these groups, their budgets are maybe $25,000 a year. But it helps them if people know that their gift is going to, that they're giving to a tax-exempt organization. And here is Jim McDermott. He blames this whole thing not on the IRS, not on Obama, not Obamagate, but on the groups that are trying to provide a public service and educate people. Let's listen.
But as I listen to this discussion, I'd like to remind everyone what we're talking about here. None of your organizations were kept from organizing or silenced. We are talking about whether or not the American taxpayers will subsidize your work. We're talking about a tax break. If you didn't come in and ask for this tax break, you would have never had a question asked of you. You could go out there and say anything you want in the world. I get the feeling that many of you and my Republican colleagues just don't believe, or you believe you should be free from political targeting, but that you should be free from any scrutiny at all. The purpose of a C3 or C4 tax exemption is to enable easier promotion of public good, not political work. It is the responsibility of the IRS to determine which groups are choosing the correct exempt status and which are trying to manipulate the system to avoid taxes and hide political organizations and campaign donors.
Now, McDermott might have a point here if the IRS subjected any liberal groups to the same scrutiny. But remember, IRS officials were asked, did you flag any groups that had progressive or liberal or organizing in the title? And the head of the IRS said, no, we didn't. We only went after groups that had Tea Party or Patriot in the title of the group. So that's unjust. That's injustice. And by the way, he says this is a subsidy. It's not. Being allowed to keep your own money is not a government subsidy. Focal Point, AFR Talk.